If you get a chance, read What If Alberta Did Vote to Leave by political scientist Stewart Prest of the University of British Columbia. The essay makes an important point. Even a clear majority yes vote in an Alberta independence referendum would not deliver independence. It would only open the door to a long, messy, and unpredictable negotiation process whose final destination is uncertain and could well leave Albertans worse off than before. Once Alberta departs, it becomes a landlocked country whose neighbors will have little incentive to negotiate concessions like pipelines. Now, before we get to the interview with Stewart, please consider supporting Energi Media's journalism by becoming a member of our YouTube channel. You'll find the URL to join in this video's YouTube description. Welcome to the interview, Stewart.
Pleasure to be with you.
Now, you wrote an op-ed that was kind of interesting, and there's some parts of it that I want to talk to you about today. And one of them is precedents. And you raised two, Quebec and Brexit. And it seems to me that Brexit is almost like a cautionary tale. Tell us a little bit about how Brexit worked out, how the process worked, and what that might mean for Alberta.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting comparison. In some ways, the situations are not identical. The UK was already a sovereign country. It was part of a supranational organization in the European Union, but had agreed to pool some elements of that sovereignty with other European states. And so Brexit was this vote now about a decade ago, where the UK considered whether to pull out of the European Union. It was brought about by then Prime Minister David Cameron, and he was trying to deal with a potential splinter within his own supporters in the conservative movement. Stop me if you've heard this before, where he thought if he could have a referendum, he'd be able to put that question to bed and give folks who were clamoring for an out of the European Union a chance to say their piece and then to have it voted down, and then they could all get on with their lives. But that's not what happened. The UK narrowly but clearly voted in favor of leaving the European Union, and so once they did that, essentially everybody was driven by this new logic that there was a legitimate expression of the population to leave the European Union, and so that triggered a whole set of very painful negotiations between the UK and the central actors in Europe over the manner of that leaving and what the UK's access would be to services that the UK still required as part of the European continent. And so that those negotiations are still ongoing, but they included things like the actual borders between the UK and Europe. There's a physical border in Ireland between North Ireland and the Republic of Ireland that had to be negotiated, and that took considerable time. There was no guarantee that the essentially the UK would stay together as it currently as it was. But on top of that, access to markets, the access to services that the European Union and UK continue to share, all of that was thrown into abeyance. The UK is still paying money to Europe and likely will be for the foreseeable future, but has lost all of its institutional say within what happens in the European Union.
Is Brexit not a cautionary tale about what happens when you let the genie out of the bottle? Because these days, who controls the political narrative? Who controls the political discussion? I had Frank Graves from Eco's Research on earlier today in an interview, and he was saying that there's so much malignant state actor interference in politics these days through social media would be the bulk of it, that 25-30% of Canadians have fallen down the rabbit hole of radical politics and anti-vax and all of that. And so as soon as you let something out like they did in Brexit, there were a lot of rumors about how Russia and China were interfering in that. And do you really get a accurate reflection of public mood or the decision-making process in the referendum result?
It's a great question, and the challenges of misinformation or even perceptions of misinformation can lead to that questioning of the legitimacy of the result, and so that becomes its own kind of challenge. If some citizens say that the things people are hearing are not legitimate parts of our conversation, it can seem to undermine the effectively the legitimacy of the whole exercise. So that is one problem. But even if we put aside all the questions of misinformation, that question still is an important one. What are people actually thinking about when they vote? It wasn't part of the piece I wrote, but another example that's useful to think about is the Charlottetown Accord. And this is in now medium-term Canadian history. It was a while ago, but it is still a really informative example where Canadians were offered the chance to vote on a constitutional amendment package called the Charlottetown Accord, meant to find a way to incorporate Quebec into the constitutional order. People ultimately, most of the Canadians voted against it, but it was not very clear even at the time what they were voting against. It seemed like many of them were not voting against the package. They were voting against Brian Mulroney. People were really tired of Brian Mulroney by then. He had been prime minister for the better part of a decade. He had been very popular at the start, and issues of corruption and the spiraling deficit and other things led to increasing criticism of the Mulroney government. And it seemed like people were just done with anything he had his fingerprints on. And so people were willing to vote down this amendment package to send Mulroney a message. It's entirely possible one could imagine a vote where people are not thinking about the long-term future of Alberta, but they're thinking about how mad they are about the current situation. And perhaps there's a sense of that Mark Carney's not listening to Alberta in the way that he ought to in the minds of Albertans. It's still a vote to leave the country, and once that's on the ballot paper, we have to take it as it's written. And so it's the great example of a bell that once rung can't really be unrung, and people may not be really thinking through the long-term implications when they vote.
Let's talk about Quebec because they had referenda in 1980 and 1995, and there it seems like the uncertainty created economic costs for the province. Head offices left after 1980. That was big migration was made the headlines. What other kinds of consequences did Quebec suffer as a result of taking, asking the question?
Yeah, and then it's an important point to emphasize that Quebec had two referenda on leaving Canada. Neither one was successful. The 1995 result was razor thin, but just the drumbeat of uncertainty around Quebec's long-term presence in the Canadian constitutional order was enough to really threaten the economic prosperity of the province, and the state essentially had to the Quebec government had to step in all sorts of fields to support Quebec cultural French Canadian cultural identity, but also to take the place of investment that was fleeing for Toronto, for the United States, for elsewhere. There was an outflow of English-speaking Quebecers to other parts of the country, given that there was no certainty around, say, the continuation of the Canadian citizenship within Quebec. So all that uncertainty put a chill on investment, led to an outflow of valuable workers, if you like, human resources of the province, and in many ways set Quebec back for a generation, and led to the final passage of Toronto over Montreal for the essentially the heart of commercial activity in the country. Montreal was once upon a time the commercial center of the country, and it is no more, and it will never be again. So this is another example of how once you start down this path, it can have all kinds of consequences that are not easily foreseeable, perhaps, but we can make some good predictions, and they can't be easily reversed.
Well, let's talk about that because one of the issues that comes up on social media all the time from the pro-Wexit, as we call them these days, is they dismiss the issue of negotiation around international around borders, but that is not a simple matter at all, is it?
No, this is a great example of the kind of thing that if you're trying to tell a story about how great the world could be if Alberta were independent, you're going to assume, oh, Alberta gets to keep its borders. Maybe it takes a little piece of BC or something like that, that it's only going to be forward progress. But the reality is, the stark reality is that if Alberta were to try to become an independent country, there is no guarantee anywhere that it gets to keep the borders that it has. everything about Alberta would become subject to negotiation, including its recognition as an independent state. It's not something that's foreordained that other states will recognize it, that will interact with it with its current borders. It becomes a question of ultimately can Alberta enforce its borders? Can it negotiate for its borders against the claims of other competing entities, including perhaps neighbors to the south, areas that are subject to strong treaty claims by Indigenous peoples? There's a good argument that they should remain with Canada, given the responsibility, the obligation and duty of the Crown to maintain those relations. There's no automatic claim new Republic of Alberta would have to those territories. So all of this is going to be thrown up into abeyance once again.
Here's a bit of a nerdy question, but this came up during the Trans Mountain expansion fights with British Columbia between Alberta and the federal government and British Columbia back in like 2016, 2017. And that is, the Canadian Constitution says that any infrastructure that crosses provincial borders is federal responsibility, and it comes under federal regulation. And the National Energy Board at the time, the national regulator, ruled several times the issue of paramountcy. The federal interest comes before the provincial interest. And so it kind of, over BC's lots of objection in BC, rammed the pipeline project through. So if now Alberta becomes independent and there is no more border, the only border that BC has is with an independent Alberta, then who regulates pipeline projects and approves pipeline projects from Alberta to Tidewater? Well, it would seem to me probably that it would be British Columbia. And I
Yeah.
don't see British Columbia ever approving a pipeline under those conditions.
Oh, and to put it in starker terms, the moment Alberta leaves the federation, the the federal government has no obligation. There is no paramountcy that Alberta can lay claim to. As part of the federation, Alberta can lay claim to the obligations owed to it by the other members of the federation, by other Canadians. There is a shared future that they can all lay claim to, and Alberta's insistent on additional access to Tidewater cannot be dismissed out of hand. There's literally no reason why Canada would have to listen to Alberta in its demands for Tidewater. You occasionally hear talk of some kind of international law that guarantees transit to Tidewater. First of all, that does not guarantee any kind of access to infrastructure. That simply does not exist under international law. Second, and this is something I think people are not aware of in Alberta in this dynamic. International law is not guaranteed in the same way that domestic law is. This idea of the federal government having paramountcy over the transmission of any kind of infrastructure that crosses provincial boundaries, that is domestic law. It is enforceable by the government of Canada. If international law is broken, there is no agency to enforce it. If the law is broken, it's up to the states collectively to enforce it. And if the collective states choose not to enforce it, then it doesn't go in, then it's not enforced. And that's why we see so many breaches of international law. They are essentially guidelines. They are agreements between independent actors, and either they're respected or not. NAFTA is an element of international law, but we see the United States violating it on a near daily basis in the recent onslaught of tariffs. And it's only Canada's ability to push back that holds the United States in line. Alberta's ability to push back would be all that's there, and Alberta would not have much to push with.
Let's talk about the political reality here, because you note that Danielle Smith has said that the referendum would work better as leverage than reality. So she would use it as leverage to get concessions from the federal government, maybe around a pipeline. The problem there is that once you say that we're only using it as leverage, you kind of lose your leverage. Is that not the case?
I think it gives everyone else in the country a reason to dismiss this as a really cynical political ploy, because you've just told everyone that this is a really cynical political ploy. And so you're saying the quiet part out loud, and it is more broadly reinforcing, I think, a widely shared perception that Danielle Smith is always and only going to be acting in her own or her province's interest, or and her interests, her province's interests are interpreted in a way that feed into her own political interests. And so, whether it's taking trips to Mar-a-Lago to try to negotiate what for all the world seemed to be a sweetheart deal for Alberta that left the rest of the country behind. So just giving up on a Team Canada approach, or whether it's rattling sabers over an independent Alberta to try to get a better deal from those same provinces that you recently left in the dust with your negotiations. It's always a Alberta first and last and only, and people get very tired of that. And this just reinforces that further. So that's one point. The other point we can make is that Ms. Smith may think that it is just a negotiating ploy, but once you put that referendum in play, then the people literally get a vote, and they may not see it as a negotiating play. They may miss that memo. If they're voting because they're mad at the current status quo, very much like David Cameron, you may have unleashed forces you cannot control. There's a real chance of a kind of sorcerer's apprentice dynamic here.
And I think that's the bottom line of your argument here is that the process is foggy and uncertain. The outcome is foggy and uncertain. There are all kinds of unintended consequences that we can't, anticipate ahead of time. Uh, the there's a very good chance that Alberta wouldn't get what it wants. Even though it sees it as an easy way to solve their grievances, which mostly revolve around the oil and gas industry, they could get unintended consequences and set the province back like it did Quebec for a long time. And I think what you're offering here is a caution. Think this through before you support
Yeah.
separatism.
Once you go down this path, you may not be able to get back to the status quo ante, and it is in many ways a trade-off between the realities, the messy realities of compromise within a federation, where the rest of the country has to listen to Alberta, no matter how tired they get of this argument, and many parts of the country are frankly pretty tired of having to deal with this kind of recalcitrance. But we're still going to do it because we're all in this together. The moment Alberta leaves, we're not in this together. Alberta is on its own, and it can only get and it gets exactly what it can force others to give it and nothing more. In a landlocked country that needs the cooperation of other actors to simply survive as an export-led market is a country begging to be taken advantage of, frankly. And so it is going to be, I think, a long, dark path if Alberta does go down it.
Well, Stuart, thank you very much for this. We're going to be exploring this. We've done a couple of shows already about it. Really appreciate your insights. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.